On behalf of the Society of Analytical Psychology, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all and hope that you'll have an enjoyable and stimulating evening, although possibly one full of paradox. The last 30 years have witnessed a great surge of interest in both Buddhism and analytical psychology. In this country, Buddhist groups have mushroomed, and Buddhism, with its freedom from dogma, its remarkable history of tolerance, its capacity to adapt to different cultural milieux, and its liberal tradition of free inquiry have even found its way through the portcullis of the Home Office, so that it is now recognized as a religion in prisons. But it is important also to recognize that there are great doctrinal differences between the various schools of Buddhism, although they are united in a common morality informed by the Buddha's words, "Suffering I teach," and the way out of suffering. Analytical psychology is also alive and well. There are 5 societies now in London offering therapy and training in ways that, like Buddhism, are both distinct and yet are united in their dedication to facilitating the process of individuation, one of Jung's fundamental and most important contributions. Individuation is nothing to do with striving for perfection. It is rather the process of becoming who one is. It therefore implies a quest for wholeness, at oneness with oneself, integrating and giving house room to aspects of ourselves that we may not welcome. And part of this process is and can be aided by the spiritual instinct. Jung writes, "The spiritual appears in the psyche also as an instinct, indeed as a real passion. It is a principle sui generis, a specific and necessary form of instinctual power." So try as we may to deny the spiritual aspect of life, one has only in this country, for instance, to attend a church at Christmas or Easter for evidence that there is a curious longing lurking in most of us, which the ups and downs of everyday life simply do not meet. But who or what is it that individuates? And what is the goal of psychic development? For some years, Jung was at a loss to know how to begin to answer this. Then in 1928, Richard Wilhelm sent him the manuscript of a Taoist alchemical text called The Secret of the Golden Flower. This was the first event that broke through his isolation. As he wrote, "I could establish ties with something and someone. I saw that here the goal had been revealed, and I understood that the self is the principal archetype of orientation and meaning. For me, this insight signified an approach to the center and therefore to the goal." But 2,500 years ago, the Buddha had come to a different insight. The Buddha was a reformer. He lived at a time when the Vedic religion was under severe criticism, and he was one of its most forceful opponents. He rejected its scriptures and its priests. His own experiences also made him recoil from the contemporary enthusiasm for asceticism. He taught a middle way between futile self-torture at one extreme and futile self-indulgence at the other, 2 forms of behavior which as therapists we frequently encounter in ourselves and in those who seek to work with us. The Vedic tradition embraced the notion of Atman, which can be translated as soul, ego, or self. The idea was that in man there is a permanent, everlasting, and absolute entity which is the unchanging substance behind the changing, phenomenal world. The Vedic tradition held that each individual had a separate soul or self which goes through many lives until it is purified and becomes finally united with Brahman, universal soul. Buddhism stands unique in the history of thought in denying the existence of such a soul or self. According to the teaching of the Buddha, the idea of self is an imaginary, false belief which has no corresponding reality, and it produces harmful thoughts of I, me, and mine, which lead to desire, craving, attachment, clinging, hatred, and other problems. But again, according to the Buddha's teaching, it is as wrong to hold the opinion, I have no self, which is the annihilationist theory, as to hold the opinion, I have a self, which is the eternalist theory. Both are fetters arising out of the false idea of I am. You may now see why I mentioned an evening of paradox. On the one hand, we have the Buddha teaching the idea of anatta, which is translated as no self. And on the other, we have Jung describing the self as our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. But whilst Jung consistently expressed a deep sympathy with Eastern thought, he was equally antipathetic to Westerners becoming involved in Eastern religious practices, which perhaps explains why, in writing elsewhere about the self, he says in his typically unknowing way, the individuated ego senses itself as the object of an unknown and supraordinate subject. It seems to me that a psychological inquiry must come to a stop here. This evening is an attempt to bridge the apparent gulf between these two positions and to discover whether or not we are dealing with two contradictory positions, or we are faced with a paradox, the sort so familiar to Meister Eckhart, who wrote, "Wherever you find yourself, observe yourself, and then leave it." To help us with our explorations, we are very fortunate to have with us this evening, immediately on my left, Venerable Vajiragnana, who is head of the London Buddhist Vihara. After ordination and completing his studies, he worked in education and was principal of a monastic college. He has since lectured in Asia, Europe, and America. In 1967, he established himself in London. He is a vice president of the World Sangha Council and Buddhist patron of the United Kingdom and Ireland group of World Conference of Religions for Peace. He is also the author of a number of publications. Sitting next to him on his left is Venerable Myokyo-ni, who was born in Austria, where she obtained a PhD in natural sciences. She came to England in 1950, where she joined the Buddhist Society, and in 1962 she left for 10 years training in a Japanese Zen monastery. She returned to England and began teaching at the Buddhist Society, later founding the Zen Centre in Christmas Humphreys House in North London, and in 1984 was ordained a Zen nun by Morinaga Sokaroshi. She has written extensively about Zen Buddhism and has translated several Zen texts and is deeply involved in the publication Zen Traces. On Venerable Myokyo-ni's left is Dr. Desmond Biddulph, who studied medicine before training as an analytical psychologist, who is now in private practice in London. He has been a student of Buddhism for many years and is editor of the widely circulated Buddhist journal, The Middle Way. Venerable Vajiragnana will talk to us first.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished speakers and friends, I would like to express my sincere thanks first to those who are responsible for organizing this meeting and for the invitation given to me to speak to you this evening. I am not going to touch on the psychology of Jung, but I would say what the Buddhist view on this particular topic that we are going to discuss. As far as I understood, that it appears that Jung believed consciousness exists simultaneously and continuously at 3 different levels, such as the ordinary consciousness, 2, the individual or personal unconscious, the 3rd, the collective consciousness. And also, ego is a constant and essential element. This is contrast with the Buddhist view of consciousness, which is of 6 kinds, according to the sense door through which it arises. Each thought moment lays on or hangs on to some kind of object. No consciousness can arise without an object, either mental or physical. Object of experience, the organs of experience, such as the eye and the consequent consciousness of experience, the mind, are indissolubly linked. They lean upon each other as one sheaf of reeds leans upon another. Mind is nothing beyond its cognizing function. Consciousness is one of the 5 aggregates, which is known as Vijnana Khanda, the aggregates of consciousness. 5 aggregates are form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. And these are the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. Consciousness is a reaction or response which has one of the 6 faculties. Faculties such as eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And these are the basis of consciousness. And one of the 6 corresponding external phenomena, such as visible form, sound, odor, taste, tangible things, and mind objects like idea or thought. And these are the object of consciousness. For instance, visual consciousness has the eye as its basis and visible form as its object. Mental consciousness has the mind as its basis and a mental object, that is, an idea or thought, as its object. So, consciousness is connected with other faculties. Thus, like sensation, perception, and volition, consciousness also is of 6 kinds in relation to 6 internal faculties and corresponding 6 external objects. It should be clearly understood that consciousness does not recognize an object. It is only a sort of awareness of the presence of an object. When the eye comes into contact with color, for instance blue, visual consciousness arises, which simply is awareness of the presence of a color. but it does not recognize that it is blue. There is no recognition at this stage. It is perception, one of the 5 aggregates that recognizes that it is blue. The term visual consciousness is a philosophical expression denoting the same idea as is conveyed by the ordinary word seeing. Seeing does not mean recognizing. So are the other forms of consciousness. It must be repeated here that according to Buddhist philosophy, there is no permanent, unchanging spirit which can be considered self or soul or ego as opposed to matter. And that consciousness should not be taken as a spirit in opposition to matter. This point has to be particularly emphasized because a wrong notion that consciousness is a sort of self or soul that continues as a permanent substance through life has persisted from the earliest time to the present day. One of the Buddha's own disciples, Sati by name, held that the master taught it is the same consciousness that transmigrates and wanders about. The Buddha asked him what he meant by consciousness. Sati's reply is classical. It is that which expresses, which feels, which experiences the results of good and bad deeds here and there. To whomever, you stupid one, remonstrated the master, have you heard me expounding the doctrine in this manner? Haven't I in many ways explained consciousness as arising out of conditions? That there is no arising of consciousness without conditions? And then the Buddha went on to explain consciousness in detail. Consciousness is named according to whatever condition through which it arises. On account of the eye and visible forms arises a consciousness, and it is called visual consciousness. On account of the ear and sounds arises a consciousness, and it is called auditory consciousness. On account of the nose and odors arises a consciousness, and it is called olfactory consciousness. On account of the tongue and tastes arises a consciousness, and it is called gustatory consciousness. On account of the body and tangible objects arises a consciousness, and it is called tactile consciousness. On account of the mind and mind objects arises a consciousness, and it is called mental consciousness. Then the Buddha explained it further by an illustration. A fire is named according to the material on account of which it burns. A fire may burn on account of wood, and it is called wood fire. It may burn on account of straw, and then it is called straw fire. So, consciousness is named according to the condition through which it arises. Dwelling on this point, Buddhaghosa, the great commentator, explains, a fire that burns on account of wood burns only when there is a supply, but dies down in that very place when it or the supply is no longer there. Because then the condition has changed. But the fire does not cross over to splinters, etc., and become a splinter fire, and so on. Even so, the consciousness that arises on account of the eye and visible forms arises in that gate of sense organ, that is in the eye, only when there is the condition of the eye, visible forms, light and attention, but ceases then and there when the condition is no more there. Because then the condition has changed, but the consciousness does not cross over to the ear, etc., and become auditory consciousness and so on. The Buddha declared in very clear terms that consciousness depends on matter, sensation, perception, and mental formations, and that it cannot exist independently of them. He says, consciousness may exist having matter as its means, matter as its object, matter as its support, and seeking delight it may grow, increase, and develop. Or consciousness may exist having sensation as its means, or perception as its means, or mental formations as its means, mental formations as its object, mental formations as its support, and seeking delight it may grow, increase, and develop. Were a man to say, I shall show the coming, the going, the passing away, the arising, the growth, the increase, or the development of consciousness apart from matter, sensation, perception, and mental formations, he would be speaking of something that does not exist. What we call a being or an individual or I is only a convenient name or a label given to the combination of 5 aggregates. They are all impermanent, all constantly changing. These 5 aggregates are not the same for 2 consecutive moments. Here, A is not equal to A. They are in a flux of momentary rising and disappearing. And Buddha was addressing a Brahmin, said, "O Brahman, it is just like a mountain river, flowing far and swift, taking everything along with it. There is no moment, no instant, no second when it stops flowing, but it goes on flowing and continuing. So, Brahmana is human life. Like a mountain river, as the Buddha told to another monk called Rattapala, the world is in continuous flux and is impermanent. One thing disappears, conditioning the appearance of the next in a series of cause and effect. There is no unchanging substance in them. There is nothing behind them that can be called a permanent self or soul, individuality, or anything that can in reality be called I. Everyone will agree that neither matter, nor sensation, nor perception, no any one of those mental activities, no consciousness can really be called I. But when these 5 physical and mental aggregates, which are independent, are working together in combination as a physio-psychological machine, we get the idea of I. There is no other being or I standing behind these 5 aggregates. The commentator Buddhaghosa says, mere suffering exists, but no sufferer is found. The deeds are, but no doer is found. There is no unmoving mover behind the movement. It is only movement. It is not correct to say that life is moving, but life is movement itself. Life and movement are not 2 different things. In other words, there is no thinker behind the thought. Thought itself is the thinker. If you remove the thought, there is no thinker to be found. Here, we cannot fail to notice how this Buddhist view is diametrically opposed to the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What we call I or being is only a combination of physical and mental aggregates which are working together independently in a flux of momentary change within the law of cause and effect. And there is nothing permanent, everlasting, unchanging, and eternal in the whole of existence. A fundamental difference in this approach to that of Western psychologists is that the Buddha saw mind as a process, whereas they see mind as a stable entity. The Buddha saw it more as a burning fire or a swiftly moving stream, but they see it rather as a solid vessel for holding experience or an unmoving slate upon which perceptions are written. We tend to think of a relatively stable body and mind which receive a dynamic and changing experience, and we therefore tend to think that mind and body can be described apart from experience. But the Buddha's language was one in which both experience and the mind and body complex were described together as part of a single process. One experiences only one thought moment at a time, at any particular time. No 2 thought moments can coexist. Ego the Buddhist teaching of the 5 aggregates precludes the idea of a firm, stable ego. In what is seen, there must be just the seen. In what is heard, there must be just the heard. In what is sensed, there must be just the sensed. In what is thought, there must be just the thought. The unit of mind or thought is made up of cognitive and non-cognitive elements, In Buddhistic terms, we say chitta and cetasika. There is no substantial entity, mental or physical, which serves to thread the various elements together. There is nothing like a dominant soul to impose its will on the other elements, either to cause or prevent their birth or death. The ego personality is nothing but a mere composition of mind and matter, the former consisting of fleeting mental states that arise as a result of the senses coming into contact with the sense stimuli, and the latter of forces and qualities that manifest themselves in multifarious phenomena. In discussing about Buddhist philosophy and Eastern psychology, Ken Wilber has suggested an explanation of the apparent conflict in the views of Buddhists and psychologists on the existence of an ego, and he suggests that the two parties are talking about different stages of mental development. Thank you.
On May the 30th, 1930, Carl Jung was the main speaker at a memorial service for Richard Wilhelm, translator of The Secret of the Golden Flower and the I Ching. In his memorial address, Jung made several observations about the way in which Eastern spirituality should influence Western thought. He noted that because of the specialization of the Western mind, it was intellectually narrow and not open to foreign influence. Wilhelm, on the other hand, showed an openness and receptivity which could understand and reshape the strangeness of the East in a more familiar form. He saw Wilhelm as inoculating the West with the living germ of the Chinese spirit, which was capable of causing a fundamental change in the modern Western world view. In this way, said Jung, we are no longer reduced to being merely admirers or critical observers, but are able in some sense to participate in the spirit of the East. Those in the West are not to participate after the fashion of beggars, being too ready to accept the alms of the East in bulk and to imitate its ways unthinkingly. If the West is to possess what has taken the East thousands of years to build, this cannot be done quickly or easily or by theft. The inoculation of Eastern wisdom must be allowed to work within the Western mind in such a way that the dangers of shallow spiritual infection from the East is avoided, and that the way forward to new spiritual growth on the old Western foundations is opened. Exposure to Eastern wisdom, therefore, is not so much the taking in of new knowledge, but rather the encounter with another way of understanding and living life which jars the Westerner loose from his narrow-minded encapsulation. Just to go back to what Chris was saying earlier on, the Buddha did use terms like no self and so on, but my feeling is he could possibly, just as easily, have talked about the Buddha way, perhaps without needing to do that. But it was because people were encapsulated, as it were, in their narrow way of seeing things that he used a very direct way of cutting through it. His awareness of consciousness is expanded, opening to the door to the experience of the unconscious. Clues are then offered to what may be discovered, but then he must, that is the Westerner, experience those things for himself. Jung, writing of the turbulent years of confrontation with his unconscious, recounts how influence from the East came in a most welcome form, namely in providing an independent confirmation of what to that point had been merely his own experience. The full reality of the psyche, as Jung technically called it, was confirmed by the conception of chitta, or mind-heart. Jung's subdivision of the psyche does not parallel the various stages in the evolution of the chitta, as instanced by the Upanishads, but there is one concept that is shared by both Jung and Eastern thought, namely libido, or psychic energy. It was disagreement over this concept that first caused Jung's loss of friendship with Freud in 1912. This started a long and fruitful relationship with Eastern ideas that confirmed his definition of the self, gave confirmation to the ideas of the collective unconscious and the archetypes by way of the concept of the alaya vijnana, or store consciousness. The mandala, in his study of the mandala, confirmed his ideas about the self, symbolizing by its central point the ultimate unity of all archetypes, as well as the multiplicity of the phenomenal world. And it was therefore, for Jung, the empirical equivalent to the metaphysical concept of the unus mundus, or the self. Jung's contribution was in seeing the process of individuation, or the individuation becoming free from primitive constraints of emotion and one-sidedness, and becoming himself in a mature way as an essentially natural process. He gathered evidence for this from religions, mythology, philosophy, and the material provided for him by his patients and through his own life. His interest in alchemy, which he saw as a transformation of psychic energy into what he sometimes called the natural man, as distinct from the robotic, rigid Western man, he found paralleled in Eastern thought and life, and as absolutely essential to the understanding of Eastern spirituality. But first we need to make some attempts at defining some of the terms we're using. Now really the problem about trying to make a definition about a symbol is that you can't define a symbol. That's why a symbol is a symbol, because it's a symbol. It can't be defined. But nevertheless, we're going to try, see what we can do. Now, we're familiar with the terms ego, archetype, self, and individuation. We shall see how Jung defines them. First of all, the ego. It's also true that the closer things are to consciousness, the more easily they are to be defined. That table we can define, and we can have agreement about really what it looks like, its form, its size, its consistency, perhaps what it's made of. It gets a little bit more difficult when it comes to the inner world. I may say it's brown, you may agree that it's sort of brownish coloured, but we won't really know whether brown for you is the same as brown for me. We don't know this, we assume. So as you go deeper into the unconscious, things become more confusing. So, now the ego is the complex factor which all conscious contents are related. It forms the centre of the field of consciousness. And insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. Now I think when Jung is using the word ego, he's not necessarily talking about the experience of I. That is something else. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness. For no content can be conscious, and that is unless it is represented to a subject. Now, the field of consciousness, however, cannot be limited, as it is capable of infinite extension. So he does make a separation between consciousness, very much as with the skandhas. Empirically, however, it finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown, which is either inner or outer. The unknown inner is designated the unconscious. We will forget about the unknown outer. The ego as a complex and specific content of consciousness rests on two seemingly different bases, the somatic and the psychic. So here I think also we have a very similar parallel with Eastern thought between mind and matter, which is one of the earliest forms of classifying things, all things. Now the somatic are both conscious and unconscious, and I think this refers to some of the skandhas, as are the psychic factors. The psychic factors are divided thus: conscious contents and unconscious contents. The conscious contents are further subdivided. The unconscious contents, I beg your pardon, are further subdivided into three. the temporarily subliminal contents that can be produced voluntarily, otherwise such as memory and so on. You can ask me something and I can tell you. Contents that cannot but erupt out of the unconscious, and those that remain unconscious. In other words, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, and the archetypes. The ego rests on the total field of consciousness, but the ego is a point of reference. In other words, it can be, again, as a colour or some sort of afferent, can be the point of consciousness. So they come together, much in the same way. Despite the unlimited extent of the basis, the ego is never more, never less than consciousness as a whole. The personality, a total phenomenon, does not coincide with the ego, that is, with the conscious personality, but forms an entirety that has to be distinguished from the ego. The total personality, which though present cannot be fully known, is called the self. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self, and is related to it like a part to the whole. The ego has choice and will. The ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation, so far as they are achieved by the will. The more numerous and more significant the unconscious contents which are assimilated to the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego is to the self, even though this approximation must be a never-ending process. To prevent inflation, a critical line of demarcation must be drawn, granting relative autonomy and reality to the figures of the unconscious. It is of the greatest importance, says Jung, that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain moral values are required: attention, conscientiousness, and patience. In other words, the process of individuation will not take place without a conscious moral effort in this direction. He goes on to say that accurate observation of the symptomatology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. And here he stresses awareness. And morality and awareness are two of the pillars of all Buddhist practice. And it would be surprising if they weren't. The archetypes are universal themes, motifs, fantasies, dreams, deliria, and delusions of everyday living, as well as patterns of behavior that have a basis in survival on the biological sphere. Psychologically speaking, the more vivid they are, the more they will be coloured by strong feeling terms. They impress, influence, and fascinate. They have their origin in the archetype, which in itself is an irrepresentable, unconscious, pre-existent form that seems to be part of the inherited structure of the psyche and can therefore manifest itself at any time. Because of its instinctual nature, the archetypes underline the feeling tone complexes and share their autonomy. The archetype is sometimes described as the image of the instinct. Those most frequently mentioned are shadow, animus, anima, otherwise man, self. Now, the confrontation with the shadow that is essential for individuation to take place is not an intellectual process, and although aspects of the personal shadow can be met and do contribute to the general expansion of consciousness, it is quite another matter when it comes to the confrontation of much deeper archetypal structures. But for individuation to take place, it is essential that this happen, because it is here that the real dynamos of the psyche are met, and this is not without danger. It is for this reason that Jung stresses the precise adaptation of the ego and a very healthy regard for the undoubted and awesome strength of these archetypal forces. It is in meeting these blind elemental opposites of liking and loathing, desire and aversion, that the real union takes place with the interpenetration of the unconscious with the conscious. It is here that the shift from ego-centeredness to self can take place. It is in the transformation and humanization of these elemental drives with which the whole process is concerned. Now, the self is the central archetype, the archetype of order, the totality of the personality, symbolized by circle, square, quaternity, mandala, child, Christ image, God image, many representations. The self is a quantity that is superordinate to the conscious ego, embracing not only the conscious, but also the unconscious psyche, and is therefore, so to speak, a personality which we also are. There is little hope of our ever being able to reach even approximate consciousness of the self, since however much we may make conscious, there will always exist an indeterminate and indeterminable amount of unconscious material which belongs to the totality of the self. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both consciousness and the unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of the conscious mind. And furthermore, the self is the life goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. Individuation is that process by which a person becomes a psychological individual that is separate, individual, whole, or a unity. Becoming a single, homogeneous being, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as becoming to selfhood or self-realization. Individuation is practically the same as the development of consciousness out of the original state of identity. Hence it signifies an extension of the sphere of consciousness, an enriching of the conscious psychological life. In other words, a process from a life led or conditioned by unconscious contents and conflict, and identity with unconscious contents, and a preoccupation with me, mine, and with survival, a movement whereby there is a shift, as it were, in the center of gravity of the total personality. Now, Jung, speaking of it, talked of it in this way. When describing a vision of his dead wife, she appeared in her prime, about 30. Her expression was neither joyful nor sad, but rather objectively wise and understanding, without the slightest emotional reaction, as though she were beyond the mists of affects. It contained the beginning of our relationship, the events of 53 years of marriage, and the end of her life also. Face to face with such wholeness, one remains speechless, for it can scarcely be comprehended. The objectivity signifies detachment from evaluations and from what we call emotional ties. Generally, they are important to human beings, but they contain projections, and it is essential to withdraw these projections in order to attain to oneself and to objectivity. Objective cognition lies hidden behind the attraction of the emotional relationship. It seems to be the central secret. Only through objective cognition is the real conjunctio possible. One-sided identification with the contents of consciousness gives rise to conflict and anxiety in an attempt to maintain that one-sidedness. Furthermore, this consciousness is narrow, rigid, and ultimately impoverished. It is the shifting of the center of gravity, as it were, from the ego to the self, with all its strength, creativity and aliveness, that leads to the rounding out of the personality, and for genuine humanity, warmth, and for relatedness to emerge. In retrospect, that's the title of the final chapter of Memories, Dreams and Reflection. Jung says the following, and I think this refers also to something what Vajiragnana said. When people say I am wise or a sage, I cannot accept it. A man once dropped a hatful of water from a stream. A man once dipped a hatful of water from a stream. What did that amount to? I'm not the stream. I'm at the stream, but I do nothing. I never think that I am the one who must see to it that cherries grow on stalks. I stand and behold, admiring what nature can do. He goes on in the next sentence to say, there is a fine story about a student who came to a rabbi and said, in the olden days there were men who saw the face of God. Why don't they anymore? The rabbi replied, because nowadays no one can stoop so low. These two statements, with their lack of intentionality, humility, and a wonder at nature, typify the spirit of Jung's life work and the process of individuation, and also provide a bridge for us between West and East. Thank you.
And I would like to take up two things. The first is what Dr. Biddulph said, and that is, if I understood right, that in the Jungian training, if I may say so, between the ego and the individuated self, there is a long gap. And I would like to go for a moment even before Buddhism to Hinduism, and that would like to quote from a very great Tibetologist, Evan Wentz, who met the Ramana Maharshi, perhaps the greatest sage of our century, and asked, when there is no more feeling of I, when the self is really attained, the Atman is really attained, what about others? And Ramana Maharshi nodded and said, my son, if the self is really realized, there are no others. And perhaps that gives a helpful tip. And another Hindu story with which I would like to illustrate how very easily we mix up our idea, and I mean our idea of I, with something that is beyond I, is the story of a young disciple who was just told by his guru about the great Atman, and that we all have that Atman in it, and that we are all Atman, and that we are all God. And the young disciple was starry-eyed about it. He just said, I, God? Yes, said the guru, I, God. And he went out for a walk to digest this wonderful fact. And as he happened to walk along the road, towards him came riding on an elephant a party of people, and in front sat the mahout, and he saw that young man starry-eyed coming along, and he yelled, get out of the way, get out of the way. And the elephant walked on, and the young man thought, I am God, he is God, shall God get out of the way of God? And he walked on. And the moment came when the elephant put his trunk round him and put him into the ditch, walked on, and shaken, the young man came back to his guru and said, you told me I was God, and I met God on the way and told him what had happened, and look at me now. The guru nodded and said, yes, but perhaps you could also have listened to the voice of God that said, get out of the way. And so you see, this is our perennial difficulty, that little I, imagining myself what I am, always mistake with an inborn feeling that we are born something more, something else, which is perhaps in Jungian terms the self, or whatever you might like to call it, something more. And therefore I would like to take the Buddhist side now and do something that we are all know and are all familiar with. There is in the Buddhist side also not only the skandhas which we have said so marvelously and perfectly elucidated, but there is also that awkward question of what is technically called the kleshas or the kilesas, the afflicting passions, as I like to call it, and which the Buddha mentioned in his very first sermon, the fire sermon, when he said the house is on fire, it burns with the fires of desire and hatred and delusion. And we do know what the passions or the emotions are, and we certainly do know the tremendous power of them. Is there anybody, if I may be, not that you should, those who have not been, is there anybody who never in their life has known a moment of real rage? Well, then we all know what we are talking about. And there is also the clear understanding in the Buddhist teaching and in the Buddhist training that those afflicting passions that flare up, and we are sitting all so cool and say, well, yes, of course, but they need to be cut off. And then shoot, up it comes, and we are, in all truth, beside ourselves. And I may have a row with my friend Desmond, and afterwards say, Desmond, I don't know what's come over me. I must have been beside myself that I said things like that. And I was beside myself because something else was talking out of me. And it was even my voice that changed in the process of being thus infiltrated. And so how to deal with it? In cold blood? Not possible. I cannot, because they're stronger than I. And there is a long training that goes along, and there are two types of them. There are the intellectual ones, which by correct information comparatively easily can be corrected. But then there are the emotional ones that need long, long training. And we all know how difficult it is when in the family or in the office or at the job we have to bear with somebody who kind of sends us up the wall. And however much we try, and however much we tell ourselves that it is not reasonable, it just doesn't work, does it? And so it is with these tremendous powers, this powerhouse that is in each one of us, that we have to work. And on the practical side, in the Zen training, there is an ideal training analogy for that. And that is that this tremendous power that is in each of us, and that you know when you work through the archetypal and various figures of the archetypes, and it has to be worked out. Well, in this particular training analogy, this tremendous energy is correctly likened to a fierce wild bull who is quite unpredictable, and coming face to face with it certainly is the stronger. And if you meet the bull on some kind of lonely big pasture, it's better to get over the next fence. And now the task is that this tremendously wild bull, who is also magnificent in his power and in his life force, and that's just what he is, but he is not by nature a very gentle pet, is he? And the task is to learn to not tame, there is a difference in nuance, but to gentle that bull. And that has to be done carefully and by stages. This is what practically works. And if I can give you an analogy for that, which is useful, most of us nowadays can swim. We have learned to swim, haven't we? This is what we believe we have. But actually, if we think of it, if a mammal, and this is what we also are, even cats that is like water, falls into water, it swims out, doesn't it? Quite naturally. And there are now experiments with babies who also swim when put into water. We, however, will have to learn to swim. Why? Because we are conscious, and being conscious we are also self-conscious, and that is the difference. And because we are self-conscious we know about life and death, and because of that we are frightened of drowning. And because we are frightened of drowning, when we fall into water and have no experience with water, yes, we cramp up, and so we go down. Whereas the cat, when it falls in, goes. And so we do not have to learn to swim. We have only to learn to overcome our fear of drowning. And that fear of drowning I cannot overcome by an act of will, because it is stronger than I am. And if again, Chris, who is also an old friend of mine, tells me, look here, Myokyo-ni, there is nothing to swimming. All you need to do is to jump in the deep end and completely relax, and you will find, truly enough, that the water will carry you. And he is speaking nothing but the truth. Do not say that he's telling Myokyo a lie. But the fact is that however much I may believe him, if I have the strength to hop in, whilst plunging down, the old thing will come. Down I will go. And so we learn from one thing, and this is the important Buddhist teaching about the no I, because I and fear are like the palm and the back of a hand. Only I can really fear to that extent. And since the Buddha was also trying to get us suffering human beings out from that dilemma of fear, is where the teaching of no I really comes in, so that it can widen up. But to go on with our swimming analogy, because we do want not only just ideas, we want to have also concrete things to work with. Jump into the water? No. We need to get used to the water. And so the way to learn to swim goes into it the shallow end, trying, experimenting in the water, until there is familiarity with the water. And we become quite, it's enjoyable, especially in the hot day, to hop about in the water and to do exercises in the water. And sooner or later then will come a moment, particularly if we have done a good amount of exercises now, and we are quite familiar with the water, and we have also got a little bit tired, that for a moment we forget our fear, for a moment we forget to be frightened of the water, and suddenly the awareness comes, floating, and at that moment comes back the fear, and down goes the foot to the safe bottom again. And so, same old exercise goes on and on until more and more familiarity comes. And in the end of it, it is possible, this is what you would know perhaps as individuation, to just open up wide and hand ourselves over to the water, which will quite naturally carry us then. To learn a specific swim style is then done in a very short time. Indeed, half an hour is good enough. But if you then want on to go to some kind of Olympic tournament, there is a lot yet to be done. So this, and I see already Chris looking energetically, is what I would like to say. And staying with the water now, to close up or to come to an end with what I was trying to say is, if we think in terms of an individual wave and the ocean, an individual wave just up, already coming over its crest and looking down as it is plunging back, if it were only conscious of I, it would be terrified, wouldn't it? But if it becomes aware that up or down and surrounded by other such individual waves, it is in any case nothing but ocean. It goes up and down and up and down with that swing of the tides and the winds in harmony with what is. That perhaps could make us a hopeful analogy. It also saves us from our final fear, and that is of annihilation, in other words, of death, because if it is only going back into the ocean, to where we always have been, which always has, not where we always have been, which always has been, there is no difficulty on that. But with that is then also released and humanized that tremendous energy which comes out as human warmth, as strength to help each other, as the creativity of the specifically human being. And suddenly things look different.